Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in case you missed the news, we know what the next ultimate is going to be in Final Fantasy XIV. As was announced in the letter from the producer live number 75, the Omega Protocol will be our next ultimate encounter. Now, that's interesting enough, but kind of what we expected. However, it's this statement that I actually want to dive into a little bit in this video. The statement that you should do all of Omega Savage if you want to know the mechanics for this ultimate. Now that shouldn't be that much of a surprise. We've really theorized on what they would actually do with Omega Ultimate, given that Omega's entire plotline is a tournament of power leading up to the finals against himself. To realize that in an ultimate, it makes sense that you'd have to in some way re-encounter all of those bosses in order to fulfill the plotline that ultimate would be following. Now, they've made statements like this before. We were told the Epic of Alexander would use everything Alexander had, or at least a lot of it, and a lot of us felt like it kind of shorted us on that. We just didn't get that out of it. So many important missing mechanics, especially things like height. So, will that happen with Omega? It's kind of tough to say, but why don't we do exactly that? Let's reanalyze every Omega Savage fight and see if we can point out some of the more iconic stuff that might show up when Ultimate comes around on January 24th. Alright, so first we have to start in the Deltascape raid tier. This was Stormblood's first raid tier, and honestly kind of didn't start the trend of the quote easier raid tier, because I would really say that belongs to creator, but at the very least it was kind of like the jumping off point for the new expansion with that sort of design philosophy that's really fed into the kind of raid encounters we have today. Now, the first encounter, Deltascape V1, was against Alt-Roit, and mind you, these are all Final Fantasy V bosses, as the entire raid tier was Final Fantasy V themed. The Final Fantasy Omega actually comes from. And Alt-Roit, well, let's just say it wasn't the best starting off point. Alt-Roit to this day is regarded to be the easiest Savage encounter that we've ever gotten, so much so that multiple free companies and groups managed to defeat it in a single pull. Now, what do we really look for something iconic in a fight that's so easy? Well, fortunately, it has one major gimmick in that of something called the classical elements. Basically, a bunch of different elemental attacks going off all at once. Sliding ice ground, fire orbs that would explode, pushing those fire orbs around with wind effects, and normally like a lightning AoE on every different player. So, that's honestly the only thing I really expect to get out of this encounter, is something reminiscent of the classical elements, maybe mixed with something else from the Deltascape tier, but honestly the only other thing would really be Clamp. This was a point blank, I guess more like a box AoE in front of Alt-Roit, and if it hit you, and if it dealt damage specifically, it would send you flying off the side of the arena. I don't think there's been any AoE that's propelled you and knocked you back as fast as Clamp. So that is the only other thing I could possibly seeing them use, but the classical elements is definitely at the top of the list. Some variation of it, a more ultimate variation of it, is all I really expect. Now, moving forward to Deltascape V2, the quality of the encounter, I'd say, went up considerably here, although this was one of the raid encounters that is really more Stormblood-esque. You see, they had just started introducing duty actions back then, and Stormblood would occasionally use them throughout various encounters. We really don't see them that frequently anymore used in endgame raids. I think, trying to think, is the last place we saw it in Eden on Ramuh? That's what's ringing a bell to me. That might be the last place we've seen one in a serious raid tier, but that's something that I would hope they wouldn't just bring back for this encounter, but also wouldn't be entirely surprised by it. So the big thing with the second encounter in Deltascape Catastrophe was there was a lot of gravity mechanics where you had to either be on the ground level or be floating in order to be hit by certain attacks. Now, that plays into the various other mechanics that there are. There's orbs that are like floating at ground level and some orbs that are floating at the higher level, and you have to know in advance whether or not you can be on the ground or not. You could also have to choose to send some people up, as there were split damage AoEs that only hit at certain altitudes. There was also, ground. The ground would like suck you in if you didn't float up, and then you'd have to do the mechanics while floating up. And then you had to also organize bringing people back down with AoEs around set players. So any of these gravity style mechanics, except without using the duty action, are completely viable things to expect. Maybe doing the classical elements while also needing to have set people floating and not floating. I do think that they are going to do the Deltascape trio, the Sigmascape trio, and the Alphascape trio, and essentially combine mechanics from the first 3 encounters of those different raid tiers. So that is sort of within my realm of expectation. Probably the most notorious mechanic in Catastrophe are these tentacles that players had to bait in the ground, and then they would read, I guess the boss would kind of put down like a sonar in the ground or something like that, and these things would detect by, you know, flipping around whether or not earthquakes were going to appear from them. You were basically looking for safe spots with them, and I guess that is the most iconic thing other than the actual gravity mechanic. So those would be a pretty interesting thing to see incorporated, but I really think the 2 different elevations is the more iconic thing, and the thing I'm expecting most to come out of Catastrophe. I'm trying to remember just from, you know, while I'm recording this, I've just got stock footage of the fight playing for you guys, but I'm actually clicking through this as I'm recording this right now, and I can't really think of anything else. I mean, there's the knockup. There's like a massive knockup that sends you into the air. There's the 3-part tank buster, but I don't expect that to be a major thing. And then there's combinations of that like sonar mechanic plus the floating and on the ground. But I don't really see anything that stands out to be more than that. I suppose there is a mechanic where you have to have like players who are like in the air targeted with debuffs, they explode, and you have to actually have the boss knock you into different sections of the arena in order to spread those AoEs away from players. So the players raised in the ground are knocked back, but the players on the ground are not. So you can handle the AoEs 2 different ways. That's there as well, but that still plays into the off the air on the ground. So I think the off the air on the ground mechanic in some capacity will be used. Maybe Alt-Roit's Wind will knock people in the air back further. But, you know, at that point, just trying to speculate putting the mechanics together. But that's the one I'm going to go with for Catastrophe. Now, moving on to Deltascape V3 Savage, this to this day is highly regarded as one of the best fights to come out of Stormblood. It's very fast-paced, mildly random, but still structured in such a way that you were not completely unprepared for it. And just really fun executionally against Halicarnassus. Yes, it's the same name as the boss from the dungeon from Hawk Manor, but that's not important. This is still, again, a Final Fantasy V reference. The big thing with this is that the arena is set up with a lot of different panels, and the players need to stand on the panels relative to the mechanic. So for example, there's ones where like a tank, a healer, and a DPS each need to stand in a panel. You need at least one. Then there's ones where the boss transforms you into animals, and you need to transform into the correct animals to stand on the correct panel. So certain roles need to fail certain mechanics in order to make sure you have enough of the transformed animal. That would regularly be regarded to as animal farm in the community. But then there's also a ton of other things. There's like book panels where every player gets hit with 50% of their HP from a book slapping down, so everyone needs to be on a different one. There's tons of ads that appear. There's hysteria mechanics. There's, you know, vines that would appear. There's water elementals that would blast your tanks and heal the boss if they were too close. There's this earth panel that would, you know, you had to stand on the correct panels, but there were also AoEs that would force you onto a single correct panel. So many different really iconic elements. It's just the whole arena is the most iconic thing about the fight. And that's a very, very interesting bit that makes it a pretty set forward thing to just pull the arena into a phase and then have to know all the permutations that are possible with whatever the boss is doing on the arena and any other mechanics that are being mixed with it to make it a more ultimate level execution. One big thing I have a pipe dream for, I don't think it's going to happen, but there is a difference between normal and savage that let a few of us down back in the day. You see, in normal mode, there's a section where the boss pulls you into another one of these arenas, except that it's a desert and it actually has a winding path and you have to find the exit before you run out of time or you just die. But the other thing that happens is if you get out of the maze fast enough, you actually get a damage buff. So the desert maze is completely abandoned on the savage difficulty, and a lot of us were disappointed. We thought maybe they'd put like antlions, so if you went the wrong way or you timed your course through it wrong, that you would be punished in some way. That would, of course, be instantly lethal. It's my hope that we'll see the Sand Maze in Ultimate, just as sort of some penance for it not being in Savage, but I don't think it'll happen. But keep that in mind when it comes out. Be on the lookout for that Sand Maze. I know I will be. However, the capstone of Deltascape, being it's a Final Fantasy V themed raid, was X-Death, and on Savage, Neo X-Death. This would actually be the first time we get a whole Savage exclusive checkpoint and phase. Whereas we have had Savage exclusive stuff prior to that, specifically in that of the Brute Justice encounter, having Winged Justice on Savage, that was only an extra 3-minute phase at the end of an already long fight. This was a case where you had, just over 4 minutes, or just under 5 minutes really, to defeat X-Death in phase 1, get him to 60% or under 60%, and then they would checkpoint you, and you would have, 12 or so minutes to do the Neo X-Death encounter. You still had to beat them both in one instance, but it was our first real case of that, and in my opinion, still to this day, the best execution of the door boss to real boss mechanic that we've seen, whether it be in Savage or Ultimate. Now, for the first phase, X-Death himself has a lot of iconic stuff. He has the tree that comes down from the middle that does a death breath with rotating vines slapping around. He has Black Hole, which is almost certainly the most iconic thing. Black holes that will instantly kill a player chasing them around, while others are placed as landmines. Meanwhile, you have baited AoE stack markers you need to time, and you have your max HP reduced. It's one that still to this day gets people, and not just because they're blaming X-Death for his cape hiding a little black hole underneath. But on top of that, it had max HP mechanics with White Hole. It had very severe tank damage. You had to be able to react to fire, ice, or lightning mechanics that would come from the boss. So there's a lot of little elements. It was a very intense, just under 5-minute phase. However, do I think they'll do that much with it? I think the black holes are the most likely thing, but it's Neo X-Death, the second phase, which also has a ton of iconic stuff. None more iconic than Grand Cross. Now, Grand Cross was already something that was iconic to X-Death way back when, known for the number of status effects it would give the player in the original Final Fantasy V. Here, it does much the same thing. It gives you a huge debuff vomit that you have to solve and deal with, while Neo X-Death is also firing other attacks at you. Those could be lasers with different shapes, and you need to make sure you don't get hit by the same shape or you get one shot. Sometimes you had to die deliberately in order to dispel a mechanic. It would leave you at 1 HP, you wouldn't actually die, but you had to do the mechanic incorrectly to do the mechanic correctly, and that's something they love doing in Ultimates, as we've learned from the past. But Grand Cross had 3 different variants, and all of them are some degree of that. So which ones would they use? I mean, they could do anything. They could just make a Grand Cross, a new Grand Cross. I mean, Grand Cross Omega is likely to be the one that we see regurgitated, Neo X-Death, teleporting around. People need to die. There's gaze AoEs, there's split damage AoEs, there's spread AoEs, there's everything you could possibly imagine, all in one big mechanic. It was always just kind of made for that style of Ultimate, like it's that same design philosophy. Makes sense given that Neo X-Death would also be the first gate to our first ever Ultimate in the Unending Coil. You had to defeat him to get to Bahamut in our first ever Ultimate in patch 4.1. So it's all very fitting, and I very much expect Grand Cross Omega to make an appearance, or some degree of Grand Cross, whether it be Alpha, Delta, or Omega, in our Omega Ultimate. Now, our second tier of Omega is Sigmascape, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm personally not a very big fan of this raid tier. I liked it on paper, I thought the boss choice was pretty good, but the execution is not something I've really held in high regard. That being said, there are definitely things that I expect to see from Sigmascape in Ultimate if we're to take that statement from the start of the video quite literally. The first encounter is against Doom Train, and that sets the precedent. These are all Final Fantasy VI related encounters. Thus, I'm pretty sure those of you who know the franchise know how it ends, even if you don't actually know much about the Omega tier. Doom Train has a few interesting things. Do I consider most of them iconic? The only thing I really consider iconic for Doom Train, or I guess there's 2 things. The first one are the ghosts. There are ghosts that are summoned, and that is very much a reference to Final Fantasy VI, where you're constantly being attacked and chased by the inhabitants of this train to the underworld. The ghosts do knockbacks, they tether and chase players, they send you to one of the cars where you have to fight off another ghost. And there's also fun little, I guess, Easter eggs inside of the normal mode. For those of you who played Final Fantasy VI, a certain thief who was a little bit, how do I say, overconfident can make an appearance randomly in those cars. Not sure they'll take that route here, but it would be interesting to see our good old buddy show up. Either way, I think the ghosts are the only thing I could really expect. They just have so many different functions, even if the real point of the fight is to control the ghosts either with your own abilities or by using the Phantom Train's own attacks to destroy them. But the only thing I'm certain there won't be, and my greatest disappointment, no suplexing. We didn't have it then, and, well, I don't think we'll have it now. Now, the second encounter in Sigmascape is Chatternook. And, you know, Chatternook does have some iconic stuff, but just such a boring fight on Savage, and not one I'm looking forward to reliving in any capacity. The big thing with Chatternook, whether it be normal or Savage, are paintings. You know, this is a painting ghost. It possesses the paintings and uses them to, you know, give itself its powers. If it goes to the fire painting, it deals, you know, lethal fire damage unless you have a water buff. If it goes to the earth one, then you need to make sure that what did the earth one even do? Was the earth, there was a water one that you had to line of sight, or you had to block, or you actually could outrange it over on the side. I remember that. There's one that like summons wind, and you have to make like an Air Force clone or something, like an Air Force painting, in order to knock all of the wind AoEs away. And I think the earth one was just you needed to be lifted off the ground. I think there's like an AoE that you needed to stand in order to safely do that, if I'm recalling correctly. So yeah, there's a bunch of little things like that. But the big thing is the paintings, and not just Chatternook, but the player. The player has a paintbrush duty action, bringing that back, of course, because that was loved so much the first time, and they have to basically take powers from the different colored paints on the ground and use those to counter the paintings themselves. Now, again, I don't think they'll do anything with duty actions. If they do use the ground paintings in any way, I feel like they would do it where, you know, you need to have like 3 people go to this one and 1 person go to this one and 2 people go to this one, and just standing on them would do it without using a duty action. But that's what I do expect. If they're going to do anything from Chatternook, it has to be the paintings, and it has to be a puzzle using the paints that are on the ground. I think it could actually be fairly compelling to have to snap decision know who needs to go to which things based on what debuffs you have or what mechanics are going out. Could be very Wormhole-esque looking over at the Epic of Alexander, which is insane to say given how easy the Chatternook encounter is generally considered to be. But hey, that sounds like grounds for something that totally fits in Ultimate. Then we come to the third encounter, Guardian. Now, on paper, this encounter is really cool, but in execution, it ends up being a little bit underwhelming in my opinion. Guardian's big thing, and this is again true in Final Fantasy VI, is it borrows attacks from other bosses in Final Fantasy VI in order to attack you. And that leads to a number of different situations inside the Savage encounter. The big thing it does is it executes the Virus program. And Virus program is another one of those vomit, you know, debuff vomit mechanics where you need to know who needs to bait this mechanic and who needs to stand there, and what the 2 people are going to be tethered together, and how do you get pulled towards each other, how do you get knocked back away from each other, all while passing a rot debuff. And if the rot debuff ever expires, it explodes on the raid. Survivable, but not ideal, and really on content without massive mitigation. Really wasn't considered a survivable thing. But I mean, that is the most iconic thing. But he would steal like Ultros program, he would steal Air Force program, he had Dada Luma, who we like to call Daddy Luma, because, you know, he was big and I don't know, he was daddy. I don't really have a good reason for that one, but that's always what we call them. And then he also had I just did this fight recently too. What was the last one? Oh, the Biblio phase, where you had to like run around and seal away Biblio enemies by having people stand on platforms. Like, he has a lot of mechanics that completely make sense inside of this setting to use, but the Virus program is the one that I would expect to show up the most. Maybe Ultros just for fun's sake, but no, the Virus program is really the #1 thing. He also had other mechanics. You know, he had lasers that were aimed at players. He had fire debuffs that would get placed on DPS that you would have to mitigate. All the adds that he would summon, he would summon an Ultros clone, he would summon a Dataluma clone, he would summon a Biblio clone. He would just do all of these like constant adds and stuff like that. And it just kind of made the fight drag on. A lot of baited AoEs, those slow missiles that I'm sure you've seen in other content. One player each standing in a tower to make sure it doesn't explode on the raid. A lot of traditional stuff, but a lot less of the design we have nowadays, which is a lot of spread stack. It is a lot of stuff that's not unique to Guardian, but is presented more uniquely than I guess other fights do it nowadays. So, I guess retrospectively, it does have some merits to it. But any of those things could show up and it would be completely within reason. Heck, they could give him a new program to run altogether. But I think they'll stick to one of the 5 that he had initially. And like I said when we started talking about Sigmascape, once you figured out it was Final Fantasy VI, you probably figured out who the final boss was. We have Kefka, and on Savage, God Kefka. One of my biggest disappointments for a final boss, not least of all because in the normal mode, they play 3/4 of his most iconic song in that of Dancing Mad, and the final verse of Dancing Mad only shows up in Savage. I mean, it's fitting, but at the same time, it's a bit debatey. Makes the normal mode feel incomplete. The big thing with the first phase of Kefka, because this is another door boss situation, is that he likes to lie to you. So he has the statue of the gods performing mechanics. One of them performs a knockback that, he can zip around because, again, he can fake his mechanics and make them do the reverse of what he says they're going to do. He has one where, you have players like 4 groups of 2 where you have to split gravity damage, and then a rock that has to be spread right after, and then he like cuts the room in half with an AoE from that. And then on top of that, he has one where you have to either look at the tower or look away from the tower. He has sleeping debuffs, and then he has confusion debuffs where your allies will attempt to attack each other, but you have to like make sure everyone's spaced in such a way that the confused players never go after anyone else or never reach them before the confusion wears off. So there's a few interesting things. The Tower of the Gods is definitely something that if they are going to bring Kefka in, I would expect the tower to make an appearance. But then Kefka himself, he has an ice AoE that's a point blank, but if he reverses it, then it's a donut AoE. If he does this like stitch pattern cross AoE with thunders, and then he reverses it, then you have to stand in the AoE in order to know that you're standing in the safe spot. And with fire, it's either spread or stack, but he can do a spread fire that's faked, which makes it a stack, or he can do a stack fire that's faked, and then you have to spread it. So there's all little things. And honestly, this whole fire, ice, and lightning thing, they used it a lot. One thing I left out from Neo Exdeath was Delta Attack, which not exactly the same, but it did pretty much work that way. Whether he was twin casting fire and you had to do 2 sets of spreads or 2 sets of baits with the ice, or on top of that, back-to-back tank busters. It's just, all of those things were present in Neo Exdeath as well. So I expect, spread fires and baited ices and thunder tank busters. Those I almost guaranteed if they're pulling from other things, because they just appear in more than one fight. And Exdeath isn't really much a difference. He teleports around the arena, he goes untargetable and forces you to deal with the tower and knockbacks and split damage. It's an okay fight, but it drags on a little too long for my taste. The big thing is God Kefka. There is an instant mechanic that I expect to see, much like how Neo Exdeath had Grand Cross. Kefka, God Kefka, has Forsaken. It's a massive AoE that essentially forces a puzzle mechanic on the group. You have ones where like the DPS get targeted by these heads, and then you also need to have max HP because you get a debuff, and the debuff is worse if you're not at max HP when it's applied, but the attack itself even reduces you to 1 HP, so it's a very, very healing intensive section, very mitigation intensive, very shield intensive as well. Stuff like Shake It Off or shields before the damage hits, so they persist after the percentage health damage hits, is all very, very important. We need to know who's taking towers. The tanks need to know how to do their tank busters. There's tons of raid damage. It's very, very well structured, even if I'm not a big fan of the fight overall. And then like the second Forsaken, range DPS have to bait an AoE, while melee DPS do a different baited AoE, while the tanks and healers do a different baited attack. And then they all have to coalesce together to make sure that they solve all of the different towers that are around, a 4-stack DPS tower, a 2-stack tank tower, a 2-stack healer tower. It's a lot of elements happening all at once. But Forsaken is the big one. It just takes all of these mechanics and starts to pull them together, especially Forsaken 3 and 4, which, while identical, basically replay the Kefka phase and make you do 3 different sets of Forsaken mechanics using the Tower of the Gods. So Forsaken is the #1 thing I expect to see. Maybe we'll have Grand Cross Forsaken. Maybe they'll just combine Exdeath and God Kefka into their own mechanics, and that's going to be hell. So I'm looking forward to it. Now, going into Alphascape, there isn't a single Final Fantasy theme here. This acts as the climax to the story. So they hit us with a little bit of nostalgia right at the beginning, pull us into something that's more lore accurate, and then we finally reach Omega at the end, and we get to deal with the finality of his internal conflict that he's dealing with as part of the story, which we'll almost certainly go into in its own video separately on the channel. Now, the first encounter is against the final boss of Final Fantasy I, in that of Chaos. And in that game, his big thing was that he could pull from all the powers of the 4 fiends. And the 4 fiends had attacks like Tsunami and Earthquake and Inferno. And here they just have more Final Fantasy XIV-esque effects, and each one of them is their own dance. Now, what was nice about Chaos is it was a semi-random fight, but it was only between one of 2 patterns. Basically, the fight either started with 2 of these special attacks, or the other 2 always in the same pairs, and the second half of the encounter makes you do the other one. So by completing the first 50% of the encounter, you essentially knew 100% of the encounter, and it was down to your consistency to execute. It made for a very smooth learning experience, and is still regarded as a really good first boss, because none of the mechanics in their own right aren't good. They're all acceptable as a first raid tier style mechanic, and they're all puzzles in their own right. Debuffs here, debuffs there, timers, all the stuff that you've come to know nowadays. Any of those things wouldn't be a surprise to show up, but honestly, the ad phase that happens in between is really where the most sense is made, because it combines debuffs from various different elements and forces you to use them in a way that isn't traditional, using like donut AoEs from the water phase to deal damage to certain players to dispel an effect from them, while the fire players, need to, I think it was like the fire players need to hit the wind players to knock them back, because the wind players, if they don't suffer a knockback, I can't remember it all because it's been a long time since I've actually done Chaos, but there's all these different elements that come into play, and debuff vomit is going to be the name of the game with Omega. Every boss across the entire Omega 12 fights, almost all of them has some sort of debuff vomit that gets thrown at the player, just tons of things that force you to solve a mechanic. And that's why I think Omega switching to footage that is from the live letter, has actual puzzle pieces in the edge of the arena. I think that's a pretty direct sign that a lot of these elements are going to be present in this fight, and probably the most likely elements to see. So for Chaos, yeah, I do expect a Chaos style debuff vomit where we have to deal with all of the different AoEs and all of the different debuffs that he applies during that ad phase, just while doing something else's mechanics. And speaking of something else, we now have O10 against Midgardsormr. Yeah, classically, Omega and Shinryu are the foils of each other. That's how it was in Final Fantasy V. And when Omega finally made his debut appearance, he made it alongside Shinryu in a giant climactic battle at the end of Heavensward. Now, some people do expect Shinryu to show up, but I think they're going to use the more lore-accurate character in that of Midgardsormr, who is also a character who regularly foils Omega's plots to destroy you, so much so that Midgardsormr has been resting ever since saving our life against Omega, if you've actually done that story, and that could play a vital role in the actual completion, in the overall puzzle mechanic. If we get something like the Codex, or we get something like Woken from Ultima Weapon, it's very possible Midgardsormr could play a role, but again, we're gonna have to touch upon that when we talk about the story a little bit more than we are now. But the Midgardsormr fight is one that is actually hated. Not because it's necessarily a poorly designed encounter, it is a very fickle encounter. The tank mechanic is dependent on whether Midgardsormr is in the air or on the ground. So each tank gets a debuff where if they're hit while Midgardsormr is in that respective position, then they get doomed and will die a few seconds later. So if you have the no getting hit by ground attacks debuff, and Midgardsormr's on the ground, you cannot be hit by him. The air tank needs to take it. What can happen is the same tank can be stuck with Midgardsormr the entire fight, and have no cooldowns to deal with what is still one of the hardest hitting tank busters we've ever had with his tail end. It is a super, super powerful tank buster that is notoriously obliterated Party Finder tanks since the day Midgardsormr came out. Yeah, it was not a good time for a lot of people. That being said, it's otherwise an amalgamation of the different dragon fights we'd had up to that point. There's a lot of Nidhogg present, especially with the orbs and the explosions, and quite frankly, I hope they leave those parts out, because while I do think the bulwark mechanic, which is basically you passing a fire resistance buff between party members before eventually dealing with those fire orbs, we just had raw flames in DSR, and I feel like while it's not a one-to-one overlap, it's not an overlap I'd like to see. If they are going to do something with Midgardsormr, I would very much prefer to see them focus on the other traits, things that are a little more just exclusive to Midgardsormr. He does these things where he like flips vertically and horizontally, and then we'll do different AoEs based on that, a donut AoE, a cross AoE, an X-style AoE, or a point-blank AoE. And I think those are more iconic to just the Midgardsormr fight, the ground and air debuffs also, but the bulwark itself showing up is not that out of the question. It may not be used necessarily with the more Nidhogg-esque mechanic, but that doesn't mean the bulwark itself won't show up. So those are just a couple of things I would expect, but I'm sure tanks are just, please don't do the ground and air thing, especially if we're not actually going to be fighting Midgardsormr. I would love a phase where Midgardsormr and Shinryu fight each other. I wanted the same thing if we had Shinryu, you know, Shinryu and Omega fight each other, and we're kind of between them. If you've played the Final Fantasy VII mod, New Threat, there's an encounter very much like that I largely think of when I think of the inspiration. But like aiming their attacks at each other, so, you know, you're caught between them, but you're trying to damage them with each other's attacks, that would be pretty cool. I don't think we'll get anything like that, though. I think Midgardsormr is going to just be another element that we'll see some mechanics pulled from, just because of what comes next after O10. I think is going to be the main precedent for the Omega Ultimate. Then we get to O11, which is actually the beetle form of Omega, the original form of Omega from Final Fantasy V. Now, it's not a one-to-one, it's a little bit more Final Fantasy XIV'd up, a little more Allegan'd up, but it's still very much the original Final Fantasy V Omega. Now, the big thing in this phase, there's a couple of big things, actually. One, the fight actually begins on this phase. The first thing we see when we zone in is Omega himself in the beetle form. And one of his mechanics is the first mechanic they showed us during the letter from the producer live. The only bit that we've actually gotten to see in that of loop. Now, what happens about 20% into the Savage fight is you're sent into the level checker section, where you have an ad placed in the middle. You have to kill the ad before it enrages, but you're also given some debuffs that have to be solved. You have some near tethers, you have some far tethers, you have debuffs that need to be dispelled by being hit by a tower, and the towers require 2 people each. So you have this like rotating game where like you have near and far tethers rotating to make sure they don't kill each other, because passing through the far tether actually is going to be lethal to your team 99% of the time. So yeah, things like that I expect to see, but we haven't seen that much yet. From the little bit of the loop that we saw from the level checker phase, we actually just see 2 towers, which would be used to dispel a debuff that you're given, that if you don't dispel, it hysterias you and you run into the wall and die. And also a tank tether, where a tank would take the tether and then run off into the distance, and it would massively decrease anyone hits max HP. And then there would be like a room wide, but now for that tank, the room wide is actually a tank buster. Now, some people did start super mitting ranged DPS to do this, but I think here it is going to be very specifically balanced for tanks to do, just because that seemed to be what the intention was with it in the first place. But that's all we get to see are these towers and that. But this, everything in O11 I expect to appear in some capacity. There's giant fists that charge at players that need to be baited. There's, you know, little fists that travel across the arena. There's little fists that you have to like force to stack up onto each other that drop these high wire buffs that give you a damage buff to make the fight a little bit easier. Not a big damage buff, but you still wanted to put it on your DPS. and make sure they got as many stacks of high wire as they possibly could, and even try to do the mechanic in a certain way that you can extend those high wires into certain parts to make other parts easier. But the big thing for me, while I think the fists will be there, I think the level checker phase will be there, I think flamethrower baits from the boss will be there, I think Pantocrator is probably the most iconic thing. Pantocrator is where the boss essentially goes berserk and just starts firing everything in its arsenal at the actual player. Now, the first time you see it, it's a little more tame. You know, there's AoEs that are all around and you have to dodge, and it's nothing too crazy. You know, you stick together, you rotate, it's not that bad. Pantocrator 2, on the other hand, has so many different elements in place. There's an AoE that's baited by a ranged DPS the party needs to stack. There's dual rotating AoEs, and eventually there's dual tank busters that each take up a third of the room, and there's persistent AoE damage the entire time, and then you have to do like 2 back-to-back 3-player baits on the nearest players, and there's so much damage, so much chaos, so much everything on the screen. And it honestly brings to light the most important thing about Omega's original fight in 011. He learns and makes every mechanic different every time you see it later in the fight. So the first time you see the flamethrower, for example, he just does, you know, a flamethrower on each player and then a bait. But then he starts mixing it with other mechanics the later the fight goes to try and force you to adapt. And that's Omega's whole thing. He is a learning and adapting machine that constantly improves in battle. And I think that is the most key element inside of this. If they were going to hide something secret that isn't Midgardstormer, that isn't maybe Alpha materializing you, for those who know the story, it would be making Omega just learn bad shit. Just imagine doing things wrong so Omega learns them incorrectly. That would be pretty funny. And again, the crux of his kind of personality and his advancement up to the point of 011. It would be pretty funny if you had to do mechanics wrong so that Omega chose to do them wrong later because he saw you doing them like that earlier. I don't know if they're going to go that crazy with it, but that would be a pretty interesting little tidbit. Now that leads into 012, which is actually Omega again, and we've actually seen these forms already in the patch 6.3 trailer, in that of Omega M and F. In this part of the story, Omega takes on mortal traits, makes himself mortal, thus defeatable, in order to learn how mortality strengthens the Warrior of Light. In this, he creates a male and female protagonist, and the background theme is actually a play on a theme that is regularly regarded to be the player character's main theme. It's very heroic, but he's kind of, you know, stolen it off you. A lot of very iconic things here, and I expect to see more difficult versions of all of them. They have combo attacks where there's spreads, there's stacks, there's baits, there's all. It's honestly, nailing down one mechanic in these isn't really doable. There are a few majorly iconic things. You know, the fight has a giant eyeball that does attacks from it, and more attacks coming from that eyeball, I expect. That is a giant Omega essentially in the background. Here it does like a point blank AoE and a line AoE, and you just have to position the rest of the mechanics you're doing kind of away from its line of sight, which, you know, not that involved really. And maybe they'll keep it to that because it does things like split the arena in two and forces you to one half of the arena. So, you know, the other mechanics they fit in that space could very well make it so that's all the eye does here as well. They could even do it where there's an eye clone. I wouldn't be surprised about that. DSR did something like that, but, you know, doesn't mean they couldn't do it here as well. And then Omega M and F have like a limit cut style mechanic where they each like dash to players and it's distance based damage. But unless they add something else to it, I wouldn't be too interested in that. They'd have to do something closer to the way Wormhole works and force you to like use the space, or even the way DSR works with Sanctity with the jumps from the Dark Knight, if they wanted to do something interesting with it. Another thing is that only 4 players can attack each of them. And while you don't need to kill them at the same time, the idea is that, you know, you have a tank, a healer, and 2 DPS on one of them, and a tank, a healer, and the other 4 players on the other one. And then they occasionally swap, and then which mechanics you're doing, or which mechanics you are looking out for, change depending on which one you are actually attached to. They could play into that a lot more, because really it's only the limit cut dash style mechanic where that is determined by which clone you're actively attacking. Other than that, it's just a way for each team to race each other, I suppose. Tons of AoE damage, tons of damage that needs to be mitigated with stuff like shields and party mitt, because it comes from the eyeball where you can't reprisal, addle, feint, things like that. So I just expect all that stuff to be kind of cranked up and mixed with other stuff. I mean, that's just the easiest way to hold predictions, is to take Omega and then take other stuff Omega has done and add it to the stuff that this Omega is doing. I think that in the Omega M&F phase that the Beetleborg is going to show up and do things. Oh, how did I even forget to mention the single most iconic mechanic in all of Omega of Larboard and Starboard? Now, Larboard and Starboard are just slightly bigger than half room AoEs where Omega spins around and then maybe does like a second one. Those will definitely show up. Sometimes he casts 2 in a row. Sometimes he does like an execution of them. It'll be like a Starboard Larboard execution where he'll just do both back to back, or he'll do double Starboard or double Larboard or something like that. But the reason it's so iconic is because of the name Larboard. So it is a real term. It's not a nautical term that's really used anymore. But a lot of his attacks are boat themed, because Omega himself is, you know, kind of a space boat in a sense, space and dimension boat. But Starboard, you know, he hits an AoE to his right, and then he spins around in like a 180, and then he'll do it again, and that's what confuses people, because now he's 180 degrees turned, but if he uses Starboard again, he'll turn another 180 degrees in the same direction. If it's Larboard, he'll go back in the other direction, so he'll just hit the same spot twice. So that confused a lot of players because of the orientation of Omega, the name of the skill, and just trying to keep track of all of that. So that is almost certainly going to show up. But I think we'll also see it in the Omega M&F phase. I think he'll keep his Beetleborg form and use it to use O11 style mechanics against the O12 style mechanics that Omega M&F have. That means tethers, that means pantocrators, that means Starboard and Larboard. I just don't see any reason for him to not constantly evolve in this manner. It's just too Omega-like to just not have him be in all of his own phases. You know what I mean? But that's not it for O12, because like the other final bosses in Stormblood with O4 and O8, Omega M&F are just a door boss. The final phase, the Savage exclusive phase, is what we call Final Omega, and it is basically just something on a completely different level. He loses his mind. He determines that mortality is not the answer. He tries to become a godlike figure instead of being immortal, and it doesn't work out for him any better. But it has a lot of very computer-esque names with everything. It's got Hello World, you know, one of the most common commands, and what almost everyone will learn when they start programming is, you know, Hello World. It's got Patch, it's got Giant Fists, and I expect they're going to play a lot more into that. Things like Update, Hotfix, you know, just all of these different sort of programming terms that Omega uses, and just add even more to them. Like, what if you're doing... So Patch is probably the most notorious mechanic for wiping, despite it not being the most iconic mechanic, where it essentially gives players near and far tethers, and you have to break them before the mechanic ends. Very similar to Asphodelos' final boss, although in that case it was just a distance-based tether. But yeah, you have to like pair up and make sure you break them quickly enough while dodging other attacks and making sure you don't have the magic vuln from that when you're hit by other things. They said that they updated Patch, which is, you know, funny given the naming convention, to make it way worse. That was like one mechanic that Yoshi P called out in particular. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's like an update in the middle of it and it like reverses your tethers. You need to know what tether you have, reverse your position for it. But also maybe you have to be marked for an update. So like you have players that are marked for update and players that aren't marked for update, but then the unmarked update players get a mark for update and a new mechanic at the same time, and then they get update. I expect weird, crazy stuff like that. That being said, Hello World is by far the most iconic mechanic. It is another debuff vomit, but it is, if you've done P8S high concept, it's basically the original high concept, and it is in every way, I think a worse, not worse as in it's like, it's not as high a quality, but just in terms of execution, way worse, because it is a full uptime mechanic. The boss is hittable, the boss is auto attacking. There's tank level damage on the tanks. There's healer. There's the healers are all spread out, so they can't just AoE people. There's very specific spacing you can use for the different mechanics. There's a lot of debuff passing, and they are going to crank that up. I'm very afraid of what they're going to do with Hello World more than anything else, because the old joke was Hello World, goodbye party. And I don't suspect that's going to be any different at this point. He does still have fists and lasers and some of the stuff from O11, but like not quite in the same way. They do like rotating lasers, or, you know, they try to self-destruct on the party and you have to clear one out to make a safe space. But those are there, but I wouldn't say they're really the parts of O12 that I expect to see the most. They'll be there, I have no doubt. They'll definitely be there, but I'm very afraid for what they're going to do with Hello World and Patch. Not to mention, I have a personal crackpot theory. So we know that the Criterion Savage developer is also working on Omega. And I've been saying, whenever Square Enix discovers or comes up with something that's brand new, they start shoving it into other content. Criterion Savage has the tripwire mechanic in the final boss. I have been saying since the day I saw tripwires that if Omega Savage is next, we're going to have tripwires. Now, I don't actually think that's that bad of a thing. Tripwires, while they are hilarious to execute and a little bit, I guess, is a little bit more visual vomit, I suppose. They also have very set rules because there's normally only 1 or 2 ways to actually solve them. So in a sense, they simplify the execution by just being direct. There being like only a couple of logical ways to resolve that type of mechanic. So if they do introduce them, it might not even be that bad of a thing. But during Hello, like if they combine it with Patch or Hello World, then, you know, the gloves are off. It could be absolute chaos. But O12's theme is what we actually hear at the end of the trailer for 6.3. It is the orchestral version, and so we can expect something absolutely nutty. I of course expect we'll see a new Omega form, and given that Alpha is a piece of Omega that he didn't accept, what if Omega accepts Alpha? He's just like, I accept you, and now I have this ultimate power, and we fight a giant mecha chocobo. Listen, I'm laughing about it now, but would I really be that surprised? Yeah, as a final phase, a little bit a giant mecha chocobo, but I expect something hideous and memorable from the final phase of the Omega Protocol. But that's it. That's going to be a wrap for all of the most iconic mechanics from the Omega raid tier. Really curious to see how much that statement ends up coming true, because, you know, if it does come true, then we're doomed. And if it doesn't come true, then I think there's going to be disappointment. So there's really no winning. Well, I guess the doomed part is us winning, but that depends on who you ask is us, because it's, we'll see. We'll see how that turns out. And also whatever gimmick mechanic they come up with, whether it's Alpha or a Midgard Summer or whatever, you know, we'll see. Regardless, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane and this history lesson on the Omega raid tier, but I'll be signing off. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. And until then, take care.